Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past week in reading. One thing that I read last week and forgot to mention was Justice League of America Volume 3, Panic in the Microverse. This is a continuation of the Rebirth version of this series, which is written by Steve Orlando and drawn by Ivan Reis. It is a decent enough superhero story. I do enjoy that Steve Orlando does a decent job of reinventing characters, which I think when you have a new version of a series is a nice thing to see, but I'm coming to realize that this is not really my kind of series, and I think that's why I forgot last week that I had even read this, because it's just very much an event. And so if you wanted to see Lobo and Batman team up and fight people in the Microverse, it might be great fun, but I'm not super interested in that. So I don't know that I'm going to keep following this series, because this is one that I've been reading because it was available on Hoopla, and now that my library system has cut back on how many titles you can borrow from Hoopla every month, I think this is one that I'm not going to continue with after this. So it's good enough, the artwork is good enough, and I think if you are more a fan of superhero crossover bits, I think this might be great, because I do think he's doing interesting things within that genre, but within superheroes, that's not my favorite take on the genre. So next up, I read a book of essays, and that was Roxane Gay's Bad Feminist. I was incredibly impressed by Roxane Gay's Hunger, which was another book of essays, when I read that last summer. And I thought that included some really insightful commentary on, primarily on the way we view weight and bodies in society, but also an incredibly powerful look at her own personal history. And I don't think I have ever read anything that was quite as open as that series of essays was. This, on the other hand, is a very different thing. It is a lot of much more superficial level commentary and a lot of pop culture commentary, a lot of which was actually about pop culture that I have never seen. So it was a lot of things that I knew the names of, but not that I had ever read. So it was a lot of things about the TV series Girls, which I've heard of, but I've never watched. Discussions about a number of things that now that I'm thinking about it, I don't actually remember, because it wasn't something that I connected with. So a lot of that didn't particularly work for me. It seemed fairly top level, but again, because I'm not particularly familiar with it, I'm probably not the best target audience for that. There were some interesting looks at a developing awareness of the intersections of class and race, and the way that plays out in small towns and in academic situations that I thought were very interesting. There's an earlier bit about starting out as a university lecturer that I thought was very interesting. So I enjoyed those two pieces, but the more surface level pop culture stuff was just sort of lost on me. So I wasn't super thrilled with that. I was expecting more either deeper commentary or maybe a different type of commentary that was going to be broader ranging. But so yeah, I feel like I just wasn't the target market for that one. After that, I read Julia Alvarez's Once Upon a Quinceañera, Coming of Age in the USA. This is in part a look at the history of quinceañeras and how they've evolved. And I think the big theory that Alvarez is positing in here is that the quinceañera as it existed in other countries has evolved along with basically the creation of the Hispanic ethnic label in 1973 on the US Census. She talks about how the traditions have merged and things that you would never have seen in a Dominican celebration have come over from Mexican traditions and vice versa. And she does a little digging into whether the celebrations were really inspired by Aztec traditions, as some people will say, or as if they were inspired by traditions that come from Spanish royalty or some combination of the two, which she actually comes up with not as much information on that. One of the really interesting things here is that there were a lot of questions that she would have liked to have asked, and writes about wanting to ask questions that are either socially awkward to ask or would be cutting ties with people that she wanted to talk to more later, so she doesn't get to ask those questions. And similarly, in some of the research, there is a lot of secondary resources that refer to primary sources that basically don't exist, that perhaps never existed or maybe just were lost to history. So that was interesting. Running alongside that is a bit of a memoir of her own coming of age. some of which include stories that clearly are what inspired stories in some of her novels. There is one bit about going to dinner in a Spanish restaurant that is almost exactly like a story from how the Garcia girls lost their accents. So that was kind of interesting. She goes into saying how she didn't have a quinceañera herself, and that her coming of age was this other process. Some of that, I think, didn't tie as directly into the rest of it because a lot of her stories went into her adulthood and were going past the teenage years, so it didn't quite tie together as neatly as it could have, but I still quite enjoyed hearing about that, especially because whenever I read a memoir from an author who's written a lot of semi-autobiographical fiction, it's always interesting to see which bits came from her own life or from her sister's lives and whatnot. So I quite liked that. And it finally answered the question that I have always wondered, which is my mother always refers to quinceañeras as a quinceañero. And you do see people in here who use both terms, which I thought was interesting because before that, my mother was genuinely the only person I knew who called it a quinceaños instead of a quinceañera. So I always thought that was kind of a relic of kind of El Salvador in the 1960s, but apparently not, because people from other generations and other culture were using it too in that book. Anyway, it was very interesting. Next up, I read Jean Luen Yang's Americanborn Chinese, which is a graphic novel that tells 3 stories, more or less, although all of them come together in the end. One of which is about as the title suggests, an American-born Chinese kid who is growing up in a primarily white environment and the kind of social awkwardness that's involved there. He later makes friends with a recently arrived immigrant from Taiwan, and he deals with the differences and similarities in the way they are perceived by their classmates. And interspersed with that is a story about the Monkey King and a story about an apparently white-looking American teenager who has an extremely stereotypical Chinese cousin who comes to visit him once a year. And this cousin is drawn as such a stereotype that I actually can't say his name because it's a racial slur. And actually I was reading this at the gym, and I moved to a different treadmill because I didn't want anyone beside me as I was reading this, because it's drawn as such an incredible visual stereotype as well, that I felt like other people shouldn't have to see that if they weren't choosing to see it. And considering that this is aimed at a younger audience, I was a little shocked at that, because I think reclaiming and playing with stereotypes is definitely something that in material for adults is very common, and it was definitely an interesting take. I was very surprised to see that in material for children. I would not have read this in public if I had known that that was in there. As a piece that combines all of these different elements and that plays with both traditional stories and with stereotypes, I thought this was very interesting. I liked the way it played out, the very cartoony style of the drawings. And this is the kind of story that you almost expect to be black and white, because you almost expect a serious comic to be black and white. But it is not. It is very brightly colored. So the harshness of some of the elements was a real contrast with that. I didn't 100% feel like it all worked. In part, maybe that was because I had too high of expectations coming into this. I did quite like the author's Boxers and Saints, which is about the Boxer rebellion. This has won a huge number of awards, which I knew going into it, which I think built up expectations. I wasn't convinced that that extreme stereotype bit of the story was done in such a way that it made the point that the author was going for. But again, it's hard for me to separate that out from the fact that I was reading this in public and felt that I probably shouldn't have been. So that's some external context that I don't know that I would have been as uncomfortable with it as I was because I was in public reading it. There's also an odd bit to the Monkey King story in that it draws it into a very Christian story, which I found a little bit eyebrow-raising. There seemed to be this emphasis of don't deny this element of your culture, of your history, but then adding it to this other history I found a little odd. But in terms of ideas, I thought this was brilliant, and I can definitely understand why it won all of the awards. But yeah, I wasn't 100% sold on the Christian Monkey King, and I wasn't 100% sold on how stereotypical the stereotype character was. But yeah, definitely interesting and definitely worth reading, although perhaps not in public. At the same time that I was reading those, I started on an audiobook that I had to give up on, and that was Orhan Pamuk's Silent House. The audio is read by 5 different narrators because there are 5 different character voices in it, and unfortunately one of the narrators is John Lee. He was also the narrator of The Museum of Innocence, which I had just listened to about a month and a half ago. The character that he narrates in this is a very different character than the narrator character in Museum of Innocence. But because John Lee has such a distinctive narrative voice and is using more or less the same mixture of English and Turkish accents, I couldn't help but draw the link between the two, and so it was much too distracting. So I put a couple of hours into this and I had to stop listening to it because I think I need more time to separate out his voice from that other character in my head. I'll get back to that at some point because I do want to read more. So what I started listening to instead was Octavia Butler's Bloodchild. This is read by Janina Edwards, who for the most part is doing a very good job, although in the first story, which is titled Bloodchild, the narrator character is male, so it actually took me a while to realize that the character was male because it's a female narrator. So that was a little bit distracting at the beginning, but once it moves on to other voices, that was no longer as distracting. And Bloodchild, which is set on an alien planet on which humans are potentially used as carriers of parasites in a almost male pregnancy kind of way, was fascinating. That was definitely my favorite story in the book, although this is a collection of both short stories and essays. I was actually surprised by the essays because they show up in the middle. So there are a few short stories, 2 essays, and then additional short stories, which I thought was strange structurally. I thought it would be more natural to have the essays either at the end or at the beginning and separate it out from the fiction. Because the essays are, one is basically the evolution of Butler's understanding of herself as a writer, and then another one is a series of tips for up-and-coming writers, which are both good but odd in the middle of the science fiction stories that are surrounding them. As I said, the first story I thought was brilliant. There is a post-apocalyptic story that is emotionally manipulative in a way that I felt a little bit resentful of. However, it was successful emotional manipulation in that I definitely was experiencing the emotions that these characters were leading you toward, but because I was conscious of how manipulative it was, I wasn't a huge fan of that overall, although I do think it worked. There is a surprisingly compelling story about love and incest, so there you go. There's a great story about Earth a number of years after aliens have landed and people are translating for these aliens who are basically communities of beings, which was really interesting. It was really fascinating. And both that and the first story about humans on another planet where other animals are using them in a somewhat parasitic way, I thought were really interestingly different takes on both the humans colonizing the galaxy and humans being colonized by aliens. Both of those were very unique takes on that situation, so I really liked both of those, even though I wasn't necessarily a huge fan of some of the in-between bits. Both of those were so brilliant that it didn't bother me that I was distracted by the positioning of the essays or the weirdness of the incest story. So yeah, that was fantastic. So really good stuff. So that was my week. I think I read a number of things that weren't quite what I hoped or expected them to be, but hey, that's life. I hope you've had a good week and have a great weekend. That's it for now.